agency should be being thrifty with the taxpayers' money, right? And they're up on the.
It's an upscale building.
They get several
Okay, for your information, we turned the audio on for the live streaming, so now everybody on the web can hear what you're saying. Oh, you can't hear me over there? If you move down there, you can hear me. It's really loud down there. Okay, now up here. Okay, does that work for everybody? You're ready? Okay. So we're changing the way we're live. Well, we're not changing the way we're live streaming, but because of the intensity of effort it takes, we're just going to live stream, and then that video will be up on the web. We're not like going back and re-editing and cutting it and making it really, really pretty, because that just wasn't worth the effort. So we just have to make sure we'll be, for the people that are on the web looking at us, if, and I'm talking to them now, not you guys, if you are having trouble seeing the screen, just type in a message on YouTube on the board there, and we'll try to adjust the kind of what we're aiming at that point as well. And if you have problems with the audio, let us know. But if you have problems with the audio, you're not hearing this, so it's a moot point. All you guys can move. So a small group today, huh? Okay. So we can be more informal.
Quality, not quantity.
Exactly. You're all the people that I would otherwise want to see.
All the folks out there watching.
Yeah. You have just been dissed. I'm sorry.
Are there more people watching?
There are more people watching, right? Mike, how many? 10, 20. 20. We have 20 people online. So thank you for watching and not coming in this lovely weather. Okay, so Wayside Cleanup Advisory Committee, Thursday, April 26th, I think. Okay. So program updates. We're still in the middle of budget season, as you all probably know, and so far so good in terms of what the department's budget looks like and ours. That will be working its way through the system, but both at the state level and seemingly at the federal level, things are stable, not growing particularly, but pretty stable. So, so we're going to continue doing what we do, and we have the resources to do that. So far so good. In terms of kind of what else we're doing, as usual, we'll do a TCE site and a PFAS site, and unless you guys are going to stop asking me about them. Everybody wearing Gore-Tex today? Because Gore-Tex has been reformulated, you know. I just want to make it clear.
As of when?
A while ago. I will check the registered letter that I have from Gore-Tex Trademark Incorporated. So in terms of PFAS, they're no longer using the long chain materials. So for PFAS sites, we are continuing to deal with a couple major PFAS sites in Massachusetts, working with particularly our water supply program at the former Devens Army base, the water supply at Devens itself, one of the wells there, and some wells nearby in air have measurable levels of PFAS, with the 5 compounds that we are concerned about, have been looking at and summing up, being above 70 nanograms per liter. And both of those water suppliers have taken the most affected wells offline in the case of air, and the affected well the case of Devon's, and have put out public notices, and AIR is working, particularly is working towards planning for and installing treatment systems for their water supplies. Westfield is going through a similar process. I think there was a vote fairly recently, or coming up soon, to budget for planning for and installing treatment systems there. So there are three water suppliers who have shut off wells and making alternative arrangements for treatment or alternative supplies to make up for the volume, based upon exceedances of the PFAS 70 nanograms per liter guideline that the water supply program uses, which is being applied to the sum of the 5 contaminants. We've talked about that before. Mark Smith had come and talked to that group last July. At that time, in more recent meetings, we've talked about how that process was going to play out. Massachusetts DEP, our Office of Research and Standards, put together an external advisory group with the Department of Public Health to look at the PFAS compounds, the toxicity involved, and to review and comment upon our recommendation that we add 5 of them together rather than the 2 PFAS and PFOA that is the focus of the EPA Health Advisory. And that work group has presented, given comments back. Mark Smith from our Office of Research and Standards is in the process of finalizing those documents, and that material will be the basis of wayside cleanups recommendations for MCP Method 1 standards and reportable concentrations that will be proposed as part of the reg package that Liz will be talking about in a few minutes. So all pieces appear to be coming together, and the timeline is such that, not to steal Liz's thunder, but we're looking to actually start those regs, kind of going through the formal process to get them out of our door. That will start after essentially May 1st. We have one little round internally of reviewing them, and then we want to get them moving. So we are on track for later this spring for public comment, early summer.
Well, now you've completely stole my thunder.
Oh, sorry. Forget I mentioned that. Is that all you're going to talk about?
Pretty much. But yeah, I think we're looking at end of June as the date, probably the best case, but within a few weeks of that, hopefully, for having the public hearing draft out.
So late spring. Liz will give you a lot more detail when she talks about this in a few minutes. But, and I'm just talking about the PFAS numbers. I don't know about the rest of those rate changes. They're a mystery to me. Yes, Matt?
So per our discussion, in this PFAS, will you be providing any updated guidance on sampling, special sampling considerations and precautions that people...
As part of that process, we do have that fact sheet. Remember that fact sheet?
I do remember the fact sheet. Are you updating your fact sheet?
Yes, that will be updated and finalized to reflect not only the toxicity values and the approach for looking at the 5 compounds, and conversely, what we expect with all the other PFAS compounds not included among the 5, and how to deal with that in the MCP risk assessment process. Should you happen to analyze for them. And the short answer is acknowledge their existence, but they are not expected to be quantified as part of the risk assessment process. But, so we will be doing that. Yes?
Just a quick question. You were talking about water supplies, three water supplies in particular that have seen PFAS, PFOA. Are you looking at other water supplies that have concentrations below 70? And if so,
the ones that we know about, and caveat all of this, there are probably more out there. So first, through the UCMR3 process, not only did we identify Westfield, Barnstable, so the Cape, Westfield were above. Devon's came up later not as part of UCMR3, but as part of sampling at the base. In addition to those, we had hits in Hudson, in the water supply there, less than 70 for all 5. And in Danvers, hits less than 70 for all 5. So they are on monitoring to keep track of that. We are doing site discovery, source discovery actions, looking at nearby potential sources, issuing requests for information about past use of these chemicals, issuing notice of responsibility where it's appropriate to start the 21E process for the site assessment and eventually perhaps cleanup as that stuff goes. So for those water supplies, we have a process in place. Once we identify a potential problem of what we're going to do, then there are others that come in periodically. We did get one where we're a small town in western Massachusetts was looking to put in a new water supply for elementary school. We had them sample for PFAS as part of the new source approval, and they found some levels of PFAS. Further investigation indicated the area was likely used for fire training purposes.
I was going to say that, yeah.
It's not there. There's more investigation that's going on. It may be limited to the shallow aquifer. Not, there are a lot more complicated issues involved with that. But that triggered the investigation. We are finding out more about that. It's likely that if you start looking for things, you will start finding them, and we anticipate that will happen as LSPs are doing the due diligence appropriate for a site, particularly at areas that might have been used as fire training areas, airports, that's manufacturers that use these products. In addition to all of that, our water supply program is working with wayside cleanup and our Bureau of Air and Waste that generally deals with manufacturers and facilities, looking for potential sources, and then we will be looking at more consistently and in an organized fashion, going out from potential sources and sampling smaller drinking water supplies, public water supplies that may or may not. And so we'll begin more consistently looking for potentially affected water suppliers. So that's in the longer term. And we'll be hopefully primarily using our lab in the Wall Experiment Station to do that. They are now set up to do the work. And once they're really up and running doing that, we'll have the resources to do more of that side source discovery. Perhaps.
What about private water supplies? What private wells?
Private wells, we are looking at private wells, as well, where we have hits in public water supplies or contamination that we know about. We are looking at the private wells that are in the area. So, for example, in Westfield, where there was a public water supply that was hit and was taken out of service, there were a number of private wells in the area. So the department has gone out and sampled in Westfield, I think it's about 70 private wells, identified a handful that were above this 70 nanogram per liter guideline, and have provided first bottled water and then point of entry treatment systems for those supplies. We'll do that. It's in other areas where we have identified PRPs, we are asking them to do a similar sort of investigation where there are potentially affected private wells in the area. So we are looking for that. And so in areas that are served, that are around potential sources, once we identify the potential sources, if there are those sources that don't have public water supplies around them, they're likely to be private water supplies. But I think a lot of those sources, and I think this is what helps in that. In a lot of areas, when we talk about public water supplies, the big public water suppliers have already sampled for PFAS as part of UCMR 3. So this effort for where we would be sampling the public water suppliers, by and large, those are the smaller public water supplies that often look and feel and taste like private wells. They serve small communities, and they're often located in areas where we have I'm going to pick on trailer parks. A trailer park that serves 50 residences, but right across the street you'll have houses that have private wells. So the sampling of that public water supply there, the small one, would then initiate, if we found something there, that would initiate looking at the private wells in the area. So there's, I think, a lot of overlap in those areas where the small public water supplies will serve as a trigger or surrogate for the private wells.
The sampling in New Hampshire is indicating that there are certainly concentrated source areas, but also as you move away from those source areas, you're seeing spot hits of PFAS in private wells where it may not be so obvious that's a PRP.
Yeah, as New Hampshire has shown, and others, and I think if you do this for many contaminants as well, not just PFAS, PFAS. If you broadly sample private wells in an area, you'll find hits of a variety of compounds, whether they're coming from septic systems, whether they're coming from use of chemicals in somebody's shed, whether it's naturally occurring material that you happen to hit a host on. So right now we are focusing on likely sources and the public water supplies that serve large numbers of people. It is not a blanket investigate all of Massachusetts to confirm the safety of every single drinking water supply, but we're focusing on where it's most likely to be.
One of the things, just this line that came out on Tuesday, is that RIDEM found in Oakland, because of high bedrock, it does appear bedrock fractures are doing that. So just to that point, they could track a particular point that went out quite a ways beyond what they would have thought, where they were getting high readings, and it appears to be following a bedrock fracture. So in high bedrock areas, you might want to.
Yeah, I mean it's no easier than a lot of our other contaminants. Where you may start out in a narrow radius around a potential source, but it certainly could lead to not only widespread contamination in some areas, but perhaps not widespread, but distant contamination. And we have, you have odd circumstances, for example, down on Cape Cod, where we do have a PFAS plume for joint-base Cape Cod migrating in the groundwater, discharging to the surface water ponds. The pond then recharges on the other side, down a gradient, into the groundwater again, into another pond, into the groundwater again, into private wells on the other side of those ponds. The migration pathways can be counterintuitive, it can be complex. That's no different from a lot of other contaminants. The lack of biodegradation for these compounds certainly kind of helps those long extended plumes.
Yeah, to that point, I took a group of my students down to the USGS toxic research site, and the Denison line showed us that very thing, and it was fascinating. But another quick question: are you looking at other sources? I was thinking, what about landfill leachate? Are we seeing PFAS, PFOA, and leachate?
The question is whether we're looking at other sources and whether we're seeing PFAS compounds in landfill leachate. That's certainly on our list of things, which is why I mentioned our Bureau of Air and Waste is involved in this as well, not just waste and cleanup, not just the water programs. Their focus is on industries that they permit, that use these materials, but also on they cover the landfills. And so we're also identifying potential landfills for sampling. Yep, it's we're doing all that at the same time. We're tracking what other states are doing throughout New England. Certainly, EPA Region 1 has been very helpful in coordinating monthly calls, among the New England states, so we're all kept abreast of what we're all doing. No surprises, hopefully. And we learn from each other, particularly learning from Vermont and New Hampshire, and what they've been doing. We are also, you may know, or if you don't, this is the announcement, there is a national summit that will be held in May that EPA is hosting in Washington, and that's for states and EPA. So we are each state can send 2 people. So we're sending Mark Smith from our Office of Research and Standards and Gary Moran, our Deputy Commissioner for Operations. Well, we'll be going. So we are kind of keeping tabs on everything. I think with the work that ORS is doing and kind of the resources that having the state lab be able to do these analysis will certainly expand kind of what we can do and how quickly we can do that. But we have been using our waste site cleanup contractors to help out in the source identification, the exposure assessment as needed. So that's all our PFAS stuff. TCE sites, that's old hat, I know. The TCE sites are continue to go on. I think what I have to report from that is, one, there's a few new sites kind of every month, every couple of months that we talk about this. But the work is going, I think, really well. And I don't know what you're, being on the other side of it, how you're seeing it and the interactions, but I think when we do the outreach to the affected, to the PRP, to the people that are living on these properties, the cooperation has been excellent. Most of the time we're not finding imminent hazards. Where we do, kind of working together, whether we provide immediately the air purification units to immediately knock down the exposures while the owner and the PRP can develop a plan. I think the focus on reducing the exposures and the potential health effects has been very good. I'm pleasantly surprised at really how well this is working. The Northeast region is bearing the brunt of all this, which is not surprising because they have a lot of the old manufacturing processes, facilities. One interesting site that came up just to kind of underscore that it's not just all vapor intrusion and it's not all kind of old closed sites. This past weekend, we were working on a site, drought weekend, in Chelsea, which had to do with excavating soil that was contaminated with TCE at a location directly across from the Chelsea High School. And again, TCE, but not vapor intrusion, having measurable levels, elevated levels of TCE in the air as a result of that remedial work that was going on. Luckily, it was at the end of the week. It was school vacation week last week, and then over the weekend. And we had our FAST vehicle out to do the immediate sampling to get quick readings on how quickly the levels were dropping as they buttoned up the site and stopped the excavation. And it was a good example of, regardless of where the TCE is coming from, being able to identify the exposure, having the monitoring in place so that you know and can see the elevated levels, and then reacting to it. The communication with the City of Chelsea and the town manager and school officials to make sure and have the information data available to make the decision of whether the students could go to school on Monday morning earlier this week. And we had that all in place. And I think a lot of the work that the Northeast region has been doing on the vapor intrusion sites really helped make what could have been a potentially, not embarrassing is not the word, but messy. That's the word. Messy situation come Monday morning when you have hundreds of students not being able to go to school because of elevated contamination levels. But the ability to sample, having all the procedures in place, the fact that it was ambient air rather than kind of a big protrusion pathway is really minor. But we had the criteria in place. We knew what the decision-making process would be, and it went, I think, fairly smoothly. Both working with the responsible party, the developer, working on the site, and the LSPs, and working with the city on it. So all in all, I think pretty well, and we were well served by having that experience in this particular case. So, any other updates that you want? All right. So, Liz, you've been on the edge of your seat now, waiting to hear about the regs and what the schedule is going to be.
Yeah. So I don't have much to add to what Paul's already said. The reason I had this on the agenda was just to highlight that we are getting to the point where it's getting real in terms of having a public hearing draft out, and I wanted all of the groups that typically take the time to review and comment to start to pencil this in, that we hope to have it out towards the end of June. If all our internal reviews happen in a relatively routine way in terms of the amount of time it's going to take for those. So that was mostly it. So if you have some groups and you're planning on that, you can start to think about getting prepared to do that review. And we will also later on be talking about the natural resource damage reg package. Originally we had that on the schedule to be out sometime in July. It will be, hopefully in that time frame or in the summer time frame. So I recognize that that's going to be, an additional burden for everyone. They will be two separate packages and really two different topics. But just for your planning purposes, wanted you to prepare for that.
That's so I can schedule my vacation.
Yeah. No vacation this summer, Lynn.
It's like the early days. What are you looking at for how long are you going to give for public review, for public comment?
Paul, do we have any sort of limitations in terms? We do have the PFAS numbers in there, and as Paul mentioned, this is the vehicle for getting those out there, and other programs are connected to that. Does that put any kind of?
There still will be plenty of time. That's one thing you can kind of let us know about. Kind of now, what you would suggest. I mean, you've heard us talk about what some of it is, but I mean, we're not going to rush it. But typically, it's
well, the mandatory time frame. We always do much more than that.
Right.
I'm not even sure what that is. I think you can actually wrap up the public hearing process on the date of last hearing. So we won't be doing that. We usually give a couple of months.
Yeah, I was thinking 2 months would be.
Especially the summer.
Would be
Yeah,
good.
preferably
Yeah,
into fall.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think depending upon the timing, if we can get it out earlier in June, unlikely, then maybe a couple months. But if it's coming out July 5th, then definitely into September.
Yes, we're sensitive to the fact that you're not all sitting around during the summer waiting.
And we can. And since there will be two reg packages, the only thing that is really time sensitive, or could be time sensitive, are the PFAS standards. For reasons, it's related to reimbursement for treatment costs. It's good to have standards. So that affects the MCP changes. Depending on the timing and the overlap, we certainly can give a longer period of time for the NRD regs kind of to compensate for that, so you can focus on one and then the other.
Right. All right, I will turn things over now to Paul Craffey.
Needs no introduction?
I don't. I'm glad you all know me.
If you can't hear me or don't understand me, raise your hand, please. As Liz said, I'm Paul Craffey. I'm the Superfund section chief. The Superfund program actually composes of two sections. One is a federal facility section, and then the other one is the one I do. I'll talk about.
Closer
Little closer to your mouth.
Okay, good. So there's two sections. There's the federal facility section, and there's a regular Superfund section. I'm in charge of that. So.
Oh, you broke it.
Promise me that if I push this button, it'll work.
I completely forgot. I get to pull it.
We hope you enjoyed Paul's presentation.
Obviously, everybody knows me because I'm the great unknown.
Boy, the government is just going today, isn't it?
I didn't put my telephone number, but here's a little tip. If you call the main number, you can ask for anybody in DEP, and they should be able to give you the telephone number. So then remember everybody's number. You just need to remember one. I just thought either start the presentation with a joke, which I could end with if somebody remembers to ask me, or a more profound comment. We obviously treat the world like we have a spare in the trunk. I know Macron said that we had planted B, but I think the spare in the trunk is better than ours. There are reasons why we have a Superfund program. Would anybody venture to guess where this is? And I'll give you a date, June 6th. Guess? 1968. That's the industrial site in Woburn. That's part of the site, yes. This was the disposal areas. Occasionally, this site would shut down 128 because of the smoke. So that's this one. I have my little plan here. This is not an error in the filming. Does anybody guess what? Anybody guess what that is?
A drum.
That's a drum. That's right. So my question to you all is, where do you put that in the conceptual site model? Transport. I don't know if there's a big. It could be. Well, this actually photo was taken by Paul himself, and the color doesn't come out very good. This is Atlas Tack in Fairhaven. In here, there is blue soil. Any guess about the contaminant? Cyanide, exactly. Now, this was completed after the state moved in, before it became a Superfund site, to complete Atlas's, quote, lagoon removal, but left stuff behind it, now gone. But this building is all gone, but that's one of the sites we deal with, or have dealt with. This is another one. This is in Lowell. This is still resin. And this was actually the first funded site that Massachusetts actually funded. Before it was on Superfund, it was a RECRA facility or a hazardous waste facility. Obviously, didn't control their waste very well or their process. So I'm not sure you can see any vegetated surface on that site. It's next to a junkyard and the Lowell iron and steel. So. Liz asked me to put a map up there. It was kind of fuzzy when I shrunk it down, but this is a location of all the current Superfund sites. It also includes the GE site in Pittsfield that is a Superfund, what they call a Superfund equivalent site. The program components include listing the new sites, the sites themselves that are listed. And once they get listed, they go through remedial action. There's an operation and maintenance component by the state. There's a delisting process. Other parts of the program include the RECRA Corrective Action Program. We also deal with EPA removals, the federal facilities, and brownfields. So this is just an overall list of what the components are. When we do new sites, usually EPA is tracking these things. They are tracking these things nationally. And EPA has roughly 53,000 sites. As of those, they are tracking 46,000. And currently, there are about 1,700 or 1,800 national priority lists or Superfund sites in the nation, and Massachusetts currently has 39. And the 39 also are considered 21 sites, so one is if we disconnect them from our program, we don't. When we do new sites, usually it involves site discovery, sometimes that's by us or by other people. We have assisted in preliminary assessment, site inspections, hazard ranking scoring, and the NPL listing. In order to get an NPL listing now, you need a governor's letter that they require government request that the site be put on the NPL. And then we deal with the sites removal from the active sites list. The Superfund phases that we deal with is remedial investigation, feasibility study, similar to the 21E program, either phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So we kind of mirror the same process. The difference is, in EPA's world, there is a more formal process for a record of decision. They do take public comments and they respond to comments in the record of decision. There's also a proposed plan during the feasibility study stage. They go into design, remedial action. I think I misspelled RA. Instead of RS, it's RA. Operation and maintenance, and there's a delisting process. Currently, Mass DEP's involvement involves the Superfund process is a split process in terms of who pays and when people, which party pays and when. For a fund lead, which means technically that's money that's arrived from the Superfund trust fund. It used to be taxed. They used to have tax and used to have the trust fund. Well, now Congress has decided to get rid of the tax or let the tax expire, and they actually fund lead sites. During the remedial action process, the state's required to pay 10% of the remedial action costs. To date, we've paid tens of millions of dollars in that. Before that, in the feasibility study, remedial design, EPA's pays 100% of the costs. And then we pay 100% of the operation maintenance of the fund lead funds. And again, we've paid tens of millions of dollars to date on those sites.
So those are important points.
Yeah. Yes, there's considerable money. It's ongoing when we pick up some of these funding sites.
So particularly when we were considering whether to put a site suggested to put it on the NPL, now a lot of the times they are abandoned sites. There aren't PRPs. So often when you think of Superfund and EPA doing the cleanup, they're fund lead sites. We do have to think carefully about it because that commits us to 10% of the cleanup costs, but also 100% of O&M. And kind of the decision-making process of kind of what remedies are selected. If you're into long-term pump and treat, for example, EPA loves that because at some point they turn that over to the state. And we're committed at, for example, at Silresum, at Baird McGuire, doing long-term pump and treat of the groundwater, and all of the issues and concerns that you raise as LSPs about the efficacy of pump and treat systems, we have the same issues at sites that we are responsible for that work.
And we also deal with putting institutional controls, either grants or what we refer to as notices of activity use limitation. Those are specifically for Superfund sites. The difference is typically an AUL will have somebody else prepare it and file it. In this case, both EPA and DEP work together to come up with what the AUL should be. There's a design statement that's done by EPA, and then we hand it off to the owner to then file it. So that's the notice. We also dealt with traditionally grants. They tend to be a little slower because there's more legal work involved. They're not equivalent, but they satisfy EPA's requirements to have some kind of form of institutional control on properties. On the other side, we have PRP-led sites. Usually they pay 100%, including oversight. EPA and Mass DEP would have regulatory authority over there. Generally, we just do the review and comment. We, again, also do institutional controls, which are grants and ULs. Currently, there are 20 funded, responsible party funded sites, and we have 8 federal facilities, 8 fund lead sites, and 3 what I consider PRP fund searches. They may end up being fund lead sites or PRP sites, depending on how the search goes with EPA. Our involvement is basically to review and comment on the remedial investigation, feasibility, and the proposed plan. In the EPA process, there are 9 criteria to list the site, and one of them is actually state acceptance. So the state does provide a significant role in the process of the Superfund. We also provide what is ARISE, which is applicable, relevant, and appropriate requirements. The issue for Superfund is they can do this ARISE process instead of getting permits. The federal government had thought that the process should not be slowed down by local, state, or even federal permits. So there's an equivalency, and what's required is the substantive standards of any of the regulations. So we propose the substantive standards that apply in the case of particular sites. We were involved in the record decision amendments. There's something else called an ESD, which is what is it called? Something of significant difference.
Explanation.
Explanations, I'm sorry. Explanation of significant difference, which is a little less than a ROD amendment. And then we provide concurrence letters. We are involved in remedial action in the design in terms of providing review and comment. And then there's once the sites have been cleaned up, there's 2 phases. One is an operation and functional phase, and EPA usually certifies the site to be operational and functional. And then there's an O&M period. Like Paul said, there's at least 3 sites that we've taken over the groundwater treatment plants. One is Silveresum, the other one is Beard McGuire, and the third one is the Groveland site. So we have been doing actually treatment, doing a lot of treatment on that for more than 10 years on all 3 of those sites.
Question?
Yes.
If the state ARARs, so I'm thinking like MCP standards, are stricter than the EPA, how is that reconciled?
Actually, state ARARs can only be stricter than the EPA.
Okay.
If EPA's rules are the same,
Then we just
take them. In terms of the MCP, we've had disputes in the past, and they've kind of worked themselves out. Very little of the MCP is considered an ARAR. Because typically, if we had standards that we say, these are the standards you meet, those would apply. What we have is something that they also have. They do a risk-based cleanup, so we allow that in our process. So they said, you allow the same thing that we're doing. So we concede to their risk-based standards. It's roughly the same in terms of the way they calculate risk, but there's a nuance there that say that the MCP doesn't necessarily apply in all cases. Now, there has been some cases where they've actually picked our numbers because they don't have one. So they'll do a cleanup number based on our numbers in certain cases. So,
Yeah. So, for example, perchlorate. EPA does not have a standard for perchlorate. Several years ago, we had perchlorate issues, particularly down in Cape Cod, and we went through the process of promulgating an MCP standard and a drinking water Massachusetts MCL for perchlorate, so that one, we would have nice, clear requirement for us, it's certainly useful for us, but also it helps in the discussions with EPA and the responsible parties, which in that case was the Department of Defense, who like having nice, clear standards, not only for the health protection, which is a goal for all of us, but also DRD and large bureaucracies like that. It makes it easier for them to point to the people that are responsible for budget and for planning to say that, look, here's the state's standard. This is what we have to meet. Why do we need this money? This is the standard. And that was very helpful in perchlorate to get the attention and the resources in order to address the problem out of the Cape. And thus, you can probably imagine why one of the time-critical pieces of our regulations at the moment is to put standards in place for PFAS, because there are no promulgated standards at the federal level.
I should back it up a little bit. The other part of Superfund, if wastes are left on site, there's also a 5-year review process. So every 5 years, EPA is required to go back and look at the site in terms of it being protected, whether it meets ARAS or not. So the state's also involved in that process, so we generally have to either update our ARAS or comment on whether we feel that the site will be protected or not. So we've gone through a number of 5-year reviews. They start at the point where EPA starts their remedy, not when it completes their remedy. So there's ongoing 5-year reviews for sites that are now still being cleaned up under EPA's process. The other component that we deal with is enforcement, and we get involved with consent decrees in association with the Attorney General. EPA has the Justice Department involved in the consent decrees. We also do, like I said, institutional patrols, and this is just for interest for somebody who might be an LSP. An LSP can provide the information to deal with any well if we have a responsible party doing it. It says a qualified environmental professional, so you can make your own mind up what that means in terms of any well process, but LSP is certainly qualified for that. Other involvements involved in the delisting process. We usually provide a concurrence letter. We're involved in the corrective action program, which I don't handle. EPA removals occasionally. There's another component, Superfund. It's a removal program, and we get involved in either proposing or get involved in any of the removal that EPA may do. There's the federal facilities. It's similar to PRP lead sites as opposed to funding sites, so there's no cost basis for the state, unless they're a PRP, I guess. And on the Mass Bay site in the Cape, MMR, are we considered a PRP in there? No?
Don't go there.
We avoid that. And then we're also involved in brownfields. We get grants from EPA and we help with distributing to cities and towns. The other part of our program, we also deal with the LUST, the Underground Storage Tank Program. For the site status, I didn't mean to dissuade the feasibility study, but the remedial investigation / feasibility study that we have involved in these sites, you can all read, so you don't need to read these. And remedial action also review design, we're involved in these other sites. Actually, yeah, so we're going to deal with those sites. The operation and maintenance we deal with. On some of these, we have the responsibility for, others the responsible party may have the responsibility for. So that's the amount of sites in those. The ones that we deal with in terms of the groundwater treatment, Baird, Groveland, and Ceresum. There are other sites, FT Rose, Sullivan's Ledge, and WR Grace and Acton, that the responsible party is dealing with the groundwater treatment. And so far, we've delisted a grand total of four. I think there's also a delisting on the federal facilities ones as well. So there's at least 5. I'll briefly just go over the federal facilities program. Like I said, I'm not in charge of that, but Ann Malowitz is, so remember her name, you call her up if you have a question about it. There's an Army Materials Testing Lab. That one's actually delisted. The Hanscom Air Force Base, they're doing O&M, and MMR and Otis, there's an active facility. The Natick Lab, the Naval Weapons Reserve Plant. The South Weymouth Air Base is basically one that's been redeveloped. This Sudbury Annex in Devens, that's delisted. Again, oh, there's 2 of them delisted. Sorry, this is the second one. And then Fort Devens is redevelopment. There's also some additional work that's going on there. I think I went over most of this, but what's been done by Mass DEP, we've managed groundwater treatment systems. We perform O&M on the following sites, and we've gotten grants or NEULs on a number of sites. Just one caveat to that is some of these sites have more than one NEUL. In fact, I think Industrial Park says dozens. So they're not all complete, but there's a list of the things that we get involved with in terms of the program.
Yeah. So if we could, just to talk about the grant versus NEUL thing.
Okay.
I mean, just
your program, tell me.
Make it a little bit more interesting. Well, I mean, this is one where it touches on kind of your experience in the MCP and how we then applied it to the Superfund program. So Superfund and working with EPA, in the past, it has always been grants, 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 grants. And the grants often took years of negotiating and to get it implemented. And that was viewed by the EPA as a real roadblock. And a number of years ago, probably 10 years ago now, there was a big push at the federal level across the country to get the land use restriction in place, because they couldn't start delisting the sites, they couldn't get them off the books until the cleanup was done and the land use restrictions were in place, and the grants were taking forever to do. So in Massachusetts, we suggested and worked with EPA, convinced them that we have in the MCP we have the option of grants and AULs and notices, and generally we don't use the grants. There are very few of them in our program. We use the AULs. We have found them to be very effective. They are not in and of themselves as enforceable as grants, but you have in Massachusetts the weight of Chapter 21E and the regulations behind them for enforceability. At the federal level, if you use a notice of AUL, you would have not only the MCP and 21E to enforce it, but you would have the federal rules and statute to enforce it. So we suggested work with EPA that we should develop notices of activity use limitations for federal sites, for surplus sites, modeled after our own AULs, and that has kind of broken the logjam in Massachusetts, so that we're now kind of registering these AULs and kind of finishing up these sites. And it's worked really well. We keep tweaking it, and you'll see in the regs, when they come out of the draft regs, that there are some more tweaks in there that we're doing to make it work more efficiently. But it's been a great kind of tool that we took from our program and applied to on the federal side.
EPA's happy at the moment. Just some other things that we've been involved with, some of the Superfund sites. There's been solar installations, rather big ones, on at least 3 Superfund sites: Charlie George, Iron Rose Park, and Sullivan's Ledge, which is this picture you see. This is between 195 and 140, so that corner. They took the top of the landfill and put solar cells on it. So they've been really successful in doing that. And the other thing that we have been involved in is there's an obscure provision in the Superfund regulations that allows the state to request a state enhanced remedy. We did that in Bedford because of the additional contamination because the site is so large and so difficult to clean up. EPA's cleanup levels didn't really cover all the potential contamination, particularly in the channels. So we decided to ask EPA, and they conceded that we could include the navigational dredging as part of the Superfund site. The only caveat to that is they said the state can pay, or somebody else can pay. They're not paying. And that they required us to be the state lead. So we're the state lead on that. And basically what it does is it deals with navigational dredging. So far, they've taken out about 600,000 or 550,000 cubic yards of contaminated material in about 25 locations in New Bedford and Fairhaven. There's probably an additional 700,000 cubic yards if they ever get enough money to deal with the federal channel. The advantage of Superfund is it allows you to dispose of or manage material on site. So what the State Enhanced Remedy has done, as well as EPA, has had these facilities called confined aquatic disposal areas, and we manage the material by putting it into that and capping it with clean material. It's also resulted in the construction of port facilities. The two main ones is, this is the Steamship Authority maintenance facility in Fairhaven. There used to be a wharf that was dilapidated, which actually was one of our sites that actually got cleaned up. So a Sector 21E site got cleaned up under the State Enhanced Remedy. For the, so they redid this facility, and it looks a lot better than it did. And then the other biggest one that we've dealt with that wasn't necessarily involved with exactly dredging is the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. There's a question about what it's called, but well, I'll call it that because that's what everybody else called it. There was at least one 21E site on this. This is tens of acres, and that's going to be the location, hopefully, for when they start building the wind farms south of Nantucket, south of Martha's Vineyard, sorry. So the proposed wind farms, this is a staging area. The reason this is important is because they needed a certain weight distribution on the facility. So this is designed to take really large loads. Unfortunately, they didn't. The wind industry hasn't caught up with our facility, but anyway, the first ship that showed up there was delivering wind turbines, and these one actually went to Plymouth over the road, but this is the only facility close by that they could put it on because of the weight issue. So this is completed, and it's ready to be used for the wind industry. And so I guess I'm supposed to talk about what's new in Superfund. And it would have been more dramatic if I had come in February, because this announcement was in January. They actually made New Bedford one of their Superfund redevelopment focus lists. So they, I consolidated this. So don't say I edited it. I did. I consolidated it just to highlight the New Bedford parts. But the one of the main focuses of Scott Pruitt was Superfund, and he did this task force recommendations of July of 2017, which the recommendations was to expedite cleanups and remedial process. We like that. Reduce financial burdens. We like that. Encourage private investment. We like that one too. Promote redevelopment and community revitalization, and to build and strengthen partnerships. So in general, we read these things and go, we like these. But the question is, what does the detail mean in terms of what this means? So at this point, it means they sent out a list and they have focused redevelopment sites, and New Bedford happened to be one of them. So, and that's the end of my talk. So any questions? Yes?
I have a question that you said Rick Ray is in demure domain?
Well, it's in the this program, and I'm somewhat associated, depending on if it ends up in a Superfund question, but
I don't know who this is a question for, but sites where EPA was historically at more concern before liquid authority was delegated, that our MCP sites have always been MCP sites, and the relevant liquid authority has been delegated. Who in DEP is responsible for coordinating with the
Can you repeat the
EPA on
question?
that, and what's DEP's role, and what EPA's role should be now that the program's been delegated?
Okay, to summarize the question, historically, REPR was run by the US EPA. Mass DEP has, in bits and pieces over several years, we have become a delegated state for many, if not all, of the different REPR pieces. So the question is, who would be the DEP contact particularly for facilities that were previously regulated under federal REPR program that may also be 21E sites, and how that interaction works and is coordinated. Did I get that? Excellent. Okay, so to the extent that it's REPR correct, I would differentiate.
Assume it's an MCP site.
Yeah, I would differentiate first facilities, operating facilities that are currently permitted as a REPR facility. So the operations of those and the permits of those are written, the permits are written by Mass DEP hazardous waste staff or EPA. And that's within the Bureau of Air and Waste. And the person who would be the contact for any facility permit work or questions would be Jim Patterson at Mass DEP. And I make a distinction between that permitted facility work versus the corrective action work. So one part of the very complicated REPR world, which I don't pretend to understand completely, is the corrective action, which is similar to the 21E waste site cleanup program. That's corrective action kicks in when you have releases that are a REPR facility. So you have a site, you have a release, it needs to be assessed, it needs to be cleaned up. And the processes, REPR corrective action is similar. The technical part of it is similar to CERCLA, similar to 21E and the MCP, assessment, evaluation, cleanup, etc. So we are a delegated state for corrective action. The work, what we have done is rewritten our adequately regulated provisions in both sets of regulations so that the work done under 21E can count towards the REPR corrective action work. There are some additional requirements under a REPR, for instance, and Paul touched upon this with CERCLA, the federal programs have a public comment process at the time of remedy selection, whether it's the ROD under Superfund or the remedy selection under REPR. That we don't have that under 21E. We don't have that separate public comment process. So if it's a REPR facility undergoing cleanup under 21E, it has to go through that process as well. And there are a couple. There's that. There's more weighty financial assurance mechanisms that need to be in place, and there's actually a requirement for DEP to audit those facilities at the end of the work after closure. So it's a requirement on us as part of the delegation. So with those three additional things, the work done under 21E counts towards REPR, and at the end of that process, you get a permanent solution under 21E and the REPR closure that would go along with that. So one set of work meeting requirements for both programs. The person who's the point person for that is Rose Knox, who works in the waste site cleanup program. And we meet monthly with EPA to make sure that we count our meetings and work is progressing on the sites. That is a simple summary. Particularly at permitted facilities, it can get more complicated because the corrective action requirements could be written into the permit requirements, and so there's a lot of back and forth and interaction. But between Jim Patterson and Rose Knox, that should cover both of those.
process you just described, would that apply to record 2020 universe sites that were MCP sites that were reopened on EPA?
The question is whether that process I just described applies to the record 2020 list, which are the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that the record 2020 list, for those of you who don't know, and again, yeah, this is all hazy in my mind as well, it's a different program. EPA has a goal to make progress on the assessment and cleanup of record sites, just like they do for CERCLA. They want to make sure there's movement and there's progress. So they have a 2020 list, which they developed a number of years ago, and we're fast approaching 2020. The list of sites that either had been permitted facilities and had got rid of their permits. I think the 2020 list doesn't include permitted facilities. I may be wrong on that, but it's a lot of the sites that had been in record before, but they want to make sure that they are assessed and cleaned up and closed out, and they want to have a schedule for that. So every year they develop targets for how many sites will go. We want to assure that there has been work done to eliminate or control human exposures, work done to eliminate or control groundwater migration. There's checkpoints for remedy selection is a big one, and for construction complete. So having built the cap or put in the pump and treat system, those are checkpoints that they want to make sure that the sites are working their way through the system. And that's what Rose spends a lot of her time working on, and the sites are part of that.
What does Jim Patterson work on?
Jim Patterson, Jim Patterson is in the hazardous waste program, and he is working on currently permitted active REPR hazardous waste facilities. So our universe is generally facilities that no longer deal with hazardous waste. They're not generating it, they're not storing it, they're not managing it, but they had in the past, but there may be a legacy of contamination left over. So they look like 21E sites. They are 21E sites.
Paul?
Yes.
The question, going back again, unfortunately, to PFAS, but the Superfund site outside Portsmouth, the Coakley landfill, which there has been PFAS discovered out in other wells, some public wells away from the landfill, with consideration to reopen a pump and treat remedy, which was bypassed due to some other procedural activities under CERCLA. Do you envision that some of the, like Charles George landfill or other landfills, might be an area for future consideration for PFAS migration, which wasn't obviously considered before?
The question is, using the example of the Coakley landfill in New Hampshire, which had a remedy shut down and closed, whether, and is now being considered to reopen the pump and treat system in order to deal with the newly discovered PFAS plume out there. Whether we in Massachusetts envision something similar happening to here, the example that was cited was Charlie George landfill. But that could have been any other landfill. And in fact, so the short answer is, yeah, that's possible. And kind of part of what we're doing, as Paul said, that there are 5-year reviews that EPA does and that we participate in, during that 5-year review, that's probably one of the questions that will come up. Is there contamination that was not previously assessed or identified that we should be concerned about? And if so, then something will happen with that. As a more specific example, Groveland. Paul mentioned Groveland. We've been running a pump and treat system, which we believe can be shut down, or we have shut down. We've stopped. We're looking to sell it, right?
No,
dismantling.
no.
Dismantling. But as part of that closure process, anybody want a treatment system? As part of that closure process, we are going to go out and we are confident that the levels of the known contaminants out there are knocked down. That if that's all that's out there, then we feel confident we can shut down the system and close out the site. But we are going to go out and sample for PFAS. It's an open question. If it's something that we didn't know about, we didn't look for, but is a problem and could be contaminating wells in the area, we need to know about that.
And other emerging contaminants.
And there probably will be other emerging contaminants long after I'm gone, yes. But right now, PFAS is...
Where are you going?
Don't shut that tree.
To the farm upstate.
Anything else?
Nobody wants to get a joke?
Yes. A joke.
Okay.
Yes.
This might be fake news, but New Jersey has the most Superfund sites, and New York has the most lawyers. I should apologize to the lawyers.
Uh-oh. Sensitivity tree.
Why? Because New Jersey had first choice.
Wow.
That's a good one.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about NRD. And last time we met, which was in January, Karen was talking about the oil spills to surface water and developing a standardized approach for doing NRD assessments for that. Subsequent to that, we had a meeting with more NRD-centric stakeholders, both on the spills of surface water, and then, is it earlier this week?
Monday.
Oh, it seems like a long time ago. Early on Monday, we had another meeting with the more specific stakeholder group on what we'll talk about today, which is releases of oil and hazardous material to groundwater and NRD assessment, a standardized approach for NRD assessments for that. So we're looking for comments now and in the near future that will help us prepare a draft set of regulations that will go out and enforce. There will be additional opportunity, and like I said, Lisa and I said before, we will give plenty of time for public comment on this because it's not time sensitive and we want to have a lot of good comment. That we expect to be happening again this summer and probably into the fall. We'll see how that goes.
Thank you. I do not have a joke. I have a lot of New Yorker cartoons that I think are appropriate to NRD, but none of them are in here, sorry to say. So just as a review, when I spoke about the oil spills to surface waters and wetlands, I gave a little common currency information with respect to natural resource damages. So I'm going to quickly review that here because it's also applicable to the groundwater conversation. And as I said, pretty much every resource you could imagine, the air that we breathe, the surface water in our rivers and streams and ocean, the groundwater, the air, the soils and sediment are all natural resources that the government holds in trust for the public. And those resources all provide services. And today we're going to be focusing particularly on the groundwater as a resource and the water supply as the service that is provided. I will note that by and large, with few disputes here and there around the country, groundwater is primarily a state-only natural resource, and so we are the trustee for groundwater. And again, there is a relationship between, but they are separate processes in terms of cleanup and damages assessment. Under cleanup, you're looking at nature and extent of contamination. That does inform the assessment under the trustee's authority, where we look at the type and extent of injuries. So really, you could have contamination that doesn't rise to the level of injury, so that's where there is that distinction. But we're looking at the same type of information that's collected. Under cleanup, you're looking to eliminate or reduce risks, and with respect to damages assessment, you're looking to take action for those resources that were injured. You're looking to compensate the public through some sort of restoration effort, which could be on site, but usually actually is off site due to ongoing cleanup or other restrictions on site. In terms of authority, we have authority under both federal law and state law. So both CERCLA and the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 create a process for trusteeship and natural resource damages and restoration. 21E also provides statutory authority, and under the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, there's statutory authority as well for the naming the secretary as trustee of natural resources and giving that office the authority to compromise or settle claims. And within EEA, DEP has been delegated authority to administer the NRDA program. There have been over 76 million in settlements in Massachusetts over the years, and the ones that are highlighted in bold include either in total or in part a groundwater component that was settled to the Commonwealth trustee. And so we have been pursuing groundwater claims primarily, and it's interesting that I would follow Paul Craffey, primarily at NPL sites. And I will note that also at PRP-led our NPL sites, that's sort of one of our unofficial criteria, is there a viable responsible party? And so for these sites in particular, they all include, as I said, a groundwater component. One of the examples is actually a 21E site, but was also settled under CERCLA, and are both authorities for natural resource damages, were the J ranges, where Textron was a contractor for DOD at what was then the Mass Military Reservation, now Joint Base Cape Cod. And so the natural resource that was injured was the groundwater in terms of the sole source aquifer, and the plumes were related to actually perchlorate contamination, as Paul alluded to earlier. Under the MCP, we do have standards for that. In terms of the restoration, just to give you an example of, well, how do you restore groundwater? Two projects were to purchase land that is in the Zone 2 of municipal wells, so it's an aquifer protection component, and two were for some regional planning on the Upper Cape to protect groundwater and other water resources, particularly with respect to nutrients, because those comprehensive plans are a necessary prerequisite to low or no interest loans for those communities to implement projects that will improve the quality of the groundwater. We are within a couple of weeks of releasing a restoration plan for the Blackburn and Union site, which, as I mentioned, includes a component for groundwater restoration. This, again, is a sole source aquifer, and the groundwater is contaminated with a variety of contaminants. And so the restoration actually, again, can have many different aspects. It can have projects that are looking to protect recharge, the aquifer protection that I mentioned earlier through land acquisition, but also either reduce the loss of clean water from the watershed or provide quality recharge to those aquifers. It can also include demand management, so water conservation efforts, as well as, similar to the Cape, the integrated management. And again, that would be only in the case where it's a prerequisite to a community then acting on that and implementing projects that ultimately protect and restore groundwater. So with that backdrop, I wanted to give you a little pictorial of what the method that led us to those settlements includes, because by and large, it's the same method that we are looking at in terms of a standard version. The components are the same. We are looking to make it more scalable to smaller areas of contamination, and also looking to see where we can have some standard inputs whereas for the settlements to date and for settlements moving forward on larger, more complex sites, we use a lot of site-specific information. So we start with an area of contamination, and we end with an area of restoration, but they are not one-to-one, and I want to give you a little sense of how we get there, and there'll be more detail as we move on, but just conceptually to illustrate, the first step is to convert that area into a volume using a recharge rate. Looking at that volume over time, so you have an area of contamination, you convert it to a volume, and you say, well, how long is that contamination persist in terms of exceeding applicable standards for groundwater that would be applicable to water supply. When you look at that volume over time, you come up with a total volume that has been unavailable, considered unavailable due to exceeding standards. Then you want to look at that total volume over time and bring it into an annual replacement volume. To say, well, year to year, how much would we have to actually replace to compensate the public for that total volume lost over that period of time. And then in Massachusetts, because our drinking water standards do provide for either interim wellhead protection areas or zone 1s or 2s for wells, we basically take that annual replacement volume and turn it into a theoretical well. If we had a well that produced the amount of water that was lost to contamination in gallons per minute or gallons per day, what area would we have to protect around that well? And that's how we get back to area, which enables us to monetize the claim, because then we can look in the community or communities that were affected, what would it cost to purchase that type of land for aquifer protection. And I'll go into a little more detail, but I just wanted to conceptually give you a sense of the various pieces of the puzzle. I'm going to switch now to a second. Liz is going to help me switch to another presentation. We are working with, just as we had for the oil spills, we're working with Industrial Economics as our consultant. And on Monday, Scott Friedman joined me for this presentation with our stakeholder group. He's not able to be here today, so I'm going to switch over and do my best Scott Friedman, although I will admit, for purposes of time today, there are some slides I'm not going to be presenting that we did present on Monday, and if you want more detail, which is what those slides provide, they will be online, and you will be able to go view that. We've created a standard approach to NRD page on the website, and certainly that will be continued to be updated and shared with all of you. So I wanted to give you a sense, this, as Scott likes to start with the punchline, we wanted basically to look at, well, you know, how could we scale this method down? How could we identify some standard inputs? And how could we back test it? And so what we did is, how we got to sort of 5 test cases, if you will, is we looked at RTMs that achieved, first we looked at those that achieved a permanent or temporary solution between April 2014 and December 2017. And that look at our database brought up 4,172 RTMs. Within those, 320 had checked GW1 on their BWSC.104 form. So that already brought it down to a more semi-manageable number. Within that, 265 actually impacted groundwater in terms of had an exceedance detected in the groundwater. Others may have checked GW1 because they were within that area, but perhaps only affected soil, for example. And later you'll see that when we looked at some standard, when we looked at scaling this method, one of the things we realized is that if you start looking at less than an acre in terms of the disposal site boundary, it really becomes problematic and really not worth looking at. So when you exclude out of that 265 all of the sites less than or equal to an acre, you end up with just 73 RTNs to look further at. And out of that, only 36 of them had reached a permanent solution. So at that point, we felt like, A, this provided us with a really good screening tool at a minimum, and also it was a manageable number that my colleague Brian and I were able to look at all 36 and come up with 5 that we felt were appropriate for back testing. And the reason we came up with 5 is they're a good geographic distribution. They illustrate, they're pretty good illustrative examples, but also we were able to eliminate out of the 36 quite a few that we wouldn't really pursue further. And that is because some were actually less than an acre. They might have put an acre on the form, but when you looked at the permanent solution statement, the area affected was actually less than an acre. Some were in areas where it was naturally occurring arsenic, which meant that the baseline conditions were already not appropriate for groundwater consumption. Some affected both wetlands and groundwater, which made them introduce a level of complexity that we were not looking to deal with in terms of back testing this method. So we're looking at 5 examples. As you can see, one of them resulted in 0 damages, and I'll explain why. And the maximum monetary damages was just over $30,000. When we're looking at groundwater, I just want to emphasize, out of all the cases we've done to date, claims and settlements, and the cases moving forward, we're looking at the only potential cases we are looking at are within GW1 areas. So in terms of the wide range of services that groundwater provides, we're looking at the extreme right side of this flow chart. We're looking at the provision services and the GW1 areas in terms of current or potential use. In terms of our screening tool gets us to that point. This is a little more complicated version of my my little illustrative example of the method earlier. But when you look at natural resource damages, what you are trying to do is balance a scale. You're looking at a debit side, which is the injury side of injured groundwater, the time frame of that injury, and bringing it into a present value, which I'll illustrate in a moment. And then you're looking at a credit side, which is, okay, how much groundwater would we need to restore to balance that? Again, we get to an acre value, as I mentioned earlier. What is the cost to that? We bring that into a current value. And when you join those two together, you take your present value of injured gallons, you multiply that by the restoration cost, you end up with your monetary damages. And again, this is, I feel this chart is very complete, but is very complicated in terms of how to explain how to get there. But hopefully as I give a couple of examples, it'll seem a little more clear. So when you're looking at that debit side, you're looking at, has there been contamination above the threshold? When was that contamination first identified? The current year, which brings everything into the present value. When will the injury end? Either when the permanent solution statement has been submitted in this case, or in the cases that we've worked on at more complex sites, the year that it has been predicted that that groundwater will meet standards again. Baseline is the conditions but for the contamination, so that's where we have to look at other factors. The discount rate is the way we bring it into the current value. The recharge rate, at this point, we are looking at either estimates that the USGS has published or a component of the precipitation rate. And that's another place where we are looking for a standard input, not necessarily one statewide value, but we're looking for good ways that we can come up with that value. And then the change in area of contamination. So for example, if a site implements a remedy that is reducing that contaminant over time, this method does allow for inputting that and therefore hopefully more closely reflecting the actual injury.
But that says constant, it doesn't say change.
Right. Well, when we first developed this, we actually made an assumption that that would be constant from the point of view of, oh, that seems like a way to standardize this. And then you'll see when we back tested it,
Can't do that because it changes.
it does change. It does change. Yep, exactly. So you'll see in a moment how that changes. On the credit side, again, taking into account the year you're actually conducting the assessment, in this case, we make an assumption that if a restoration project is implemented, like say acquiring land for aquifer protection, that it provides benefits to all of us in perpetuity. Again, we use the same discount rate. The pumping rate, again, we're creating a theoretical well, either gallons per day or gallons per minute, and we are calculating how much land area would be required to protect that theoretical well. And for the larger cases, we have actually used the interim wellhead protection area formula, but in these, to make it scalable, we're using the Zone 1 formula that is provided for in the drinking water regulations. And in terms of determining what that dollar value per acre is, we typically, for the larger, more complex cases, we use a site-specific assessor's data, but that can be really time-consuming. So we're looking at what other sources of data can we avail ourselves of that would be more straightforward, easy to obtain. And so far, we've looked at, we've thought about a couple of things. One is the actual valuations of state-owned land. The state makes payments in lieu of taxes to communities where the state owns property. And every year the Department of Revenue values those parcels. So that's one option because that's calculated annually. It's a well-established method. Another possibility that we're looking into is the state also makes grants for aquifer land protection and looking at the cost of that. So I keep talking about present value. And so what this method does is it says, okay, it's 2018 right now, but we need to be able to look at the past, which is when did the groundwater become contaminated till the present day when, for the purposes of this method, we are assuming it is now, because it's reached a permanent solution meeting standards. For our other cases, we also looked into the future. And so basically the value of a gallon, or as Scott always says, $1 today is different than if I give you $1 in the year 2000 or if I'm going to give you $1 in 20 years from now, or 18 years from now, I guess, 2036. So we need to be able to account for that. And it's essentially similar to if you had an annuity or you were calculating interest, it's a similar sort of thing. So that as you look back in time, the volume, the present value is actually higher because the cost of things happening in the past are higher than the future. And so for this, again, this keeps it constant for the purposes of illustration that the unavailable volume is constant over time. But even if it's not, basically when you get to the current year, you're equal. So it's a really difficult concept to think about. I have to say I spent most of my career avoiding math. And then I went back to graduate school about 12 years ago now, and one of my first courses was microeconomics. And I was so relieved because I now have to look at these kinds of charts all the time. And so I was glad to learn about present value volume. But you're ultimately trying to say, okay, today, what's the value, what's the amount of groundwater over time that's been lost in today's value, and what, therefore, do we need to, how much, therefore, do we need to restore? I mentioned that for some of our more complicated sites, we use the interim wellhead protection area formula, but one of the things that we realized, the reason it's not scalable is because it does assume this minimum radius that would have to be protected around that theoretical well. And the zone 1 does not. You can't end up with, you know, a small injury and a large claim, which you would under the interim wellhead protection area. And again, this is industrial economics analysis. When they looked at all of the RTNs, the 265 RTNs, one of the things they found is that even when you apply the zone 1, you end up with a pumping rate of a theoretical pumping rate of 215.44 gallons per day. That once you get below that, you start getting really essentially negative values. And so this was helpful because it gave us a very clear de minimis threshold and relates to, this 215.44 relates to the choice of the 1 acre. That if once you get below 1 acre, it really doesn't make any sense at all to include a site for NRD analysis. An acre of disposal site boundary. So again, bringing this back to this chart, in terms of injured quantity of groundwater, expressed as gallons, that comes from taking an acre plus and converting that to gallons, and then coming up with your damages. And so this schematic, for those of you who are really interested, and again, the presentation is even more detailed than this, but this shows you the math behind each schematic. So when we're looking at how much volume is injured, we're taking the acres, we're converting that to square feet and multiplying it by a recharge rate, which is expressed in feet. We end up and multiplying that by cubic feet to turn it into a volume down to gallons. So that's how we get from acres to gallons. Essentially, we want to end up with how much per day. And so we look at all the volume that's been injured over time divided by the days in a year. We end up with gallons per day of current value. And as I mentioned, the acres comes straight from our drinking water regs in terms of the formula for a zone 1 protection around that small theoretical well. Things we learned, again, I mentioned the area of contamination. At this point, we have a clear sense of minimum area. We are looking to explore if determining and actually publishing a maximum makes sense. There are some sites within that 73 of greater than or equal to an acre that just seem too big for this. We would use maybe the interim wellhead protection area and not the zone 1, but we need to look further at that. Again, a minimum pumping rate. We have to look at whether we can develop a maximum. We might also look at time frames. We don't look at anything that really closes out within a year in this case. And the reason that's different than these oil spills to surface water is that when groundwater is no longer injured, it's no longer injured because the sampling shows that it now meets standards. There's sort of more of an on-off in terms of the injury. So these are all the releases historically that we looked at. The 5 that we chose for back testing are in the various regions. And in terms of the specifics that were plugged into the model, this gives you a sense. They range in area from 1 to 2 acres. The start of injury is also quite a range, back from 1990 to 2012. The end of injury, again, those all fall within those 3 years where these RTNs filed a permanent solution statement. The recharge was based on these values. We've developed 4 different watersheds as a standard input, but we're looking for some comment on that, and you'll see that in the more detailed presentation and as we move forward. When you get down to whether or not we include the de minimis information in there to sort of further screen it, and you'll see that one of them actually fell within, I thought there was a little graphic there, fell below the de minimis, and that's the one that resulted in 0 damages. So even though it sort of made its way through the screen in terms of the initial database search, when Brian and I looked then further at the documentation, turns out it's actually going to fall out of it would fall out of the claims category and into the de minimis category. And as you can see, the others range in damages from around 9,000 up to just over 32,000, using again an assumption we're making about land values, which we got a lot of feedback from on last Monday that we're going to be looking for further feedback on as we move forward. This gives you a sense. I mentioned that we do account for the start of remedial work. In this case, I believe both of these were groundwater, some version of a pump and treat system that started during a particular year. So you have the start of the contamination, it's level until then, and then again we need to, in a standard method, make assumptions, and in this case the assumption is that it would decrease linearly until the date at which standards are met again. And this red versus blue gives you a sense that the present value volume is greater in the past than it is in the present. It does come to the point where they are equal. And I want to credit Scott and Sophie who put this, who have been doing the analysis for us, who put this presentation together, who hopefully will not watch me potentially have left something out of what he needed to say. And look forward to questions from you. Yes.
One clarification, Kevin. At one point you said sites less than an acre worth of farming with the minimum area of 3/4 of an acre.
Right, so the initial analysis, and I'll go back to that slide, and you'll see that's probably the reason that something fell out. So basically, when we looked at the pumping rate of 215.44 gallons per day, that does equate to 0.75 acres in terms of an area. And for the purposes of the screening, we basically captured everything an acre or less just because it was a, I don't really want to say a nice round number, but for the purposes of the screening, we looked at everything under an acre. But that's why you see that later, one of them that we put through the model did fall out of the analysis to no damages.
I think the answer, part of the answer to the question is we rounded up.
We did round up. For the purposes of the analysis, we rounded up.
Calculation was 0.75, but for the purposes of the analysis, we round up to an acre to be the de minimis.
So what do you say when you talk about applying this? Are you talking about applying it to sites over an acre or over 3/4 of an acre?
Well, that's one of the questions that we'll be asking, but I think it would probably be like an acre. I mean, that would be.
Several of your sites would still have fallen out if you should. They're less than an acre.
One.
You would have only had 2 sites.
Well, no, these are just the 5. Well, I should explain a little more about why we picked these 5. So out of the 36 that we ended up with after the final screen, and Brian and I felt like that was a manageable number for he and I to look through the files. We came up with 5 because we felt we couldn't run all 36 through the back testing of the model, because we started to notice some interesting things as we looked in, particularly like, for example, sometimes the form didn't always coincide well with the report in terms of area affected. So we wanted to find 5 that corresponded the most closely, that made sense to backtest the model.
No, I totally get that. I guess what I'm looking at is required compensatory recharge protection area.
Right.
Is that not what I'm supposed to be looking at for acres for de minimis?
Area of groundwater contamination.
The first row.
The first row. This
Oh,
one.
gotcha.
This, yes, de minimis area of contamination was that's where, that's the,
So one ended up being de minimis anyway, but
Right.
it had over 2, got it.
right. Because, and actually, thank you for asking, because that is something Scott would want me to emphasize. The reason is, even though, because we're not just looking at area, we're looking at area over time. So in that case, even though this was 2 acres, the start date of injury was 2012. So when you run it through the model, you end up actually with a gallons per day hypothetical. You end up with a hypothetical pumping rate of gallons per day that's actually below the de minimis because the injury was such a short time frame, even though it was higher in acreage. So both acreage and it's the area and the time that really factor into determining the size of that theoretical well. And so even though it met the de minimis size, when you run it through the model, it still did not meet the de minimis pumping rate. Thank you. I appreciate being able to clarify that, and Scott would too.
So kind of a couple takeaways from this. One, the groundwater assessment is a lot more complicated than the surface water. So we are internally and will externally be kind of asking questions about one, kind of the development of the model, 2, the inputs into the model, and then questions like what should be de minimis and maximum things that fall out. De minimis, it would just fall out and we wouldn't pursue the damages. The maximum we can think of as what are sites that are outside the boundary conditions, that if we were to have a standardized approach, what kinds of sites really are too complicated for that, or too big, or too something, so that instead of standardized approach, we would want to do more site-specific. That's kind of the usefulness of thinking about the maximum values. And then the other thing we'll be seeking more comment on, and we have to do a good job of writing up specifically kind of where we need input, because there are a lot of details here, are what the values are, where they come from, what are alternative sources for them. If you go back and look at the video from Monday's meeting, we had a big discussion about the input values for the land costs. And we use the values of the cherry sheets for state-owned properties across Massachusetts as a surrogate for what would be the cost of acquiring land in those communities. There are problems for that. But that was something that was readily available, regularly updated, and you could use in a standardized approach because everybody had access to it. But are there different places you could go? Are there different databases? Are there different values you could use? Or would you use that data in a different way? So you can ask all of these. So this is just the beginning of standardized approach is good because it lets everybody know kind of what the equations would be, how one would calculate this. But even if you have a standardized approach, how it's implemented and kind of whether it makes sense for you kind of run automatically, whether we should still be doing a site-by-site evaluation using the standardized approach, or whether we should be doing site-by-site evaluation using some other approach. There are a lot of different options that are on the table that we'll be seeking comment on.
When you were identifying the sites, did you capture when you were looking at start of injury, how the statute of limitations would apply to the start of injury that you identified, or did you not pursue that?
For the purposes of this, we didn't consider statute of limitations because this is not actually going out and doing it. It's looking for sites that would help us understand the model, help us understand how it would be used, what factors we would need to know, how we would get that information, what could be pulled off forms, what could be pulled off databases. So it was that aspect. The statute of limitations is a separate kind of question that would deal with what universe of sites would be subject to or eligible for, depending upon your perspective, this kind of assessment. And
Can I follow up?
Yep.
So Karen, you mentioned what the total number of sites, potential sites that you identified.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember what the number was, but as of such and such a date, there was some potential number.
Right. Well, we only looked at sites that reached permanent solution between April 2014 and December 2017. That relates to the information that we felt was available for the analysis. And of those, when we came down to the final analysis, there were 36 RTNs that we felt total. Yep.
So I think kind of where I think your question is kind of asking, or going to, is should we have a standardized process in place? How would it be implemented? Does DEP have any plans on going back and applying this historically to sites? And all of that is still subject to some decisions. But I think what we're looking at here is setting up a process, certainly for looking ahead as sites close out, get their permanent solutions, having this kind of analysis be run. But the fact that we looked back historically was primarily to test out the model, not as this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, but just to be transparent, I think that the reason for my question is that it's part of the rulemaking. I think if you can expect to receive questions under the cost-benefit provisions of exactly what's how do you receive the impact.
Right.
There's obviously been a lot of work put into this over, by my count, at least 4 administrations. The idea of standardized approach to NRD, and I think part of the pitch has to be is the going forward piece, and then some sort of clarity about what's the universe of existing sites that we're really talking about.
Exactly.
In terms of defining the area of groundwater contamination, I assume you're talking about using GW1 standards as being contaminated as opposed to any detectable?
Right. Yes. Yeah, it has to be exceeding an appropriate threshold in terms of drinking water quality. So it's not just, oh, we detected a contaminant. It has to exceed a threshold to be considered in here.
But that would be the GW1 standard.
Or another applicable water.
Well, that's what I'm asking.
Well, for this analysis, what we're focusing on is the use and the loss of use as drinking water.
Yes.
So for those purposes, what we're concerned, groundwater use as drinking water. So for those purposes, the area of contamination that we're concerned about is what area of volume exceeds GW1 standards and thus is not available for use as drinking water.
Right. But there are obviously some cases where the most sensitive MCP standard is lower than the drinking water standard.
Right. So I think part of what we kind of looking back at the data that's available for defining the area of the plume and the area of the site, what you can pull off the form. An LSP, any given LSP, when they fill out that box about what is the area of the site, they will interpret that in different. Right now, they interpret that in different ways. So, and that's partly because that information isn't necessarily used for really critical decision making. So, well, it will be, and that's one of the things that we would recognize, and that we would have more guidance. It might involve modifying the forms, so they may be different, separate questions. What's the area of the site? What is the area of groundwater groundwater contamination of GW1. You know, we may recognize that the available information that we have doesn't nicely match up with what would be good for us, and can we adjust the forms to get better information, and then do the training so that we do get consistent data.
What type of sites and PRPs will be subject to natural resource damages? Will it be PRPs that cause the contamination? Will it eligible persons that bought a contaminated site to clean it up are going to be subject to natural resource damages? Is it going to be sites that go through and close out under the MCP within the allotted time frame, or ones that miss and extend? I mean, and to be honest, when I see the numbers you've come up with at the end for acres of damage, and picking up on what Jeff said, it seems like you've spent a lot of time and effort for, in the context of cleanup costs. I've seen penalties for mishandling asbestos that were orders of magnitude higher than that. So. No, I don't know.
Right. Well, I guess a couple of things. One is that I think Chris Ayers isn't here, and I feel like that first question as to the liability should be addressed by an attorney and not me.
Yeah, well,
but so I'm right. Will be, and should be instead of me. In terms of why we're doing this is because actually you are right in terms of if we did a site-specific analysis and ended up with this amount of damages, well, probably the 9,000, but up to the 32, we've done them, and you know, it really doesn't take a lot of time if you have the data, and that's the key to what Paul was saying earlier. And to run these didn't really take much time at all. So in terms of why we're doing this, even though it results in what look like small amounts of money, it really, because we're using a lot of standard inputs in addition to site-specific data, it really isn't that burdensome to run the model and apply the method. In terms of restoration, again, we would look to have a pretty efficient grant-making process. We haven't decided yet whether it would be similar to the oil spill and done by watershed, but there would be an ability to pool smaller amounts together. We do have a lot of existing grant programs in Massachusetts that deal with a lot of groundwater, a lot of the types of restoration projects that we were discussing earlier, so it might be a way to perhaps partner with them. So in terms of implementation, we wouldn't have taken it this far if we felt it weren't something that we could manage in an efficient way, because that is the goal.
Yeah, I think you're right that right now we are doing these on a case-by-case basis, or more correctly, we're not doing them on a case-by-case basis.
We're doing just the big ones.
The time and effort required isn't worth kind of the process, what comes out the other end. But our goal is by standardizing the process that changes that cost-benefit analysis. And the combination of making it easier and more efficient to actually do the assessment and collect money, and then pooling the money so that, yeah, any given one, $9,000 might not seem a lot. But if you have a bunch of those in a watershed and you make a grant available for a town to acquire land and protect land using that money, that's valuable.
I think one of the things, you were just looking at permanent solutions, I would think this would have the biggest impact on temporary solutions, because that goes on to infinity, kind of by definition. So I would think that would really weigh in on whether somebody would want to maybe go the extra mile to go with a permanent solution or come up with more of a serious remedy. I mean, you can obviously do it with the calculations.
Yeah, so I think it's clear. Right, that's a good point, and again, something that we can write up and seek more specific comments on. But what we focused on here is the easy, clear, things to make a point and to go through the demonstration and run the model. But you can look forward, and for some, for some sites on site-specific basis, we do look forward, into the future. The temporary solutions there is the element of this may go on for many years. We talked earlier about the pump and treat systems that we run. How long did EPA estimate we run the silt resin pump and treat system?
Initially 500 years, now it's like 300.
That would be a temporary solution. And there are ways of taking that into account. For this purposes, we just stopped at the permanent solution and then moved backwards. There is the possibility, using the same model and same process, of looking at somebody filing a temporary solution and making some estimates for how long this is going to go on. Again, those are estimates. There are different input parameters that would be used. That might be something that's more on a case-by-case basis, but still using the standardized model. There are ways of dealing with that, and that is when you choose when one files a temporary solution versus a permanent solution. Part of what goes into that, as you all know, is some feasibility aspect of it, and feasibility includes costs. And one of the costs that are not being adequately considered at the moment for some of these sites are the costs of natural resource damages. It's just being ignored because there's no credible threat for medium to small sites that the department is going to actually come looking for those damages. That may change. And that may change the permanent versus temporary solution decision.
And I guess I also want to note that the compensatory restoration costs were based on, as Paul mentioned earlier, using a land value that we actually got a lot of feedback on Monday that may not actually reflect the value of the lands in the place of injury. So, and as I said, usually, exactly, too low. So again, but we don't also want it, we want it to be something that is defensible and reasonable. So we're looking at, well, what other sources might there be for land values where we're not undercompensating the public, but appropriately compensating the public. And so that's one of the areas that we asked the stakeholder group and we asked you, and we will continue to look for hopefully better sources of information, but again, in a way that we can easily input them into the model and don't add that extra administrative cost that we're seeking to avoid.
So as we told the work group earlier this week, we welcome comments now. Any comments, any suggestions, any thoughts that you have, to the extent that they can be any questions can be answered now, that we know what the answers are, then we will post the questions and our answers on the web page of NRDA. Just Google it, try searching. Try working with our website. Just NRD Massachusetts standard. That should get you there. And we'll pick them up. Other questions and comments that we need more time for, we'll let you know we need more time, and we'll incorporate those either as comments to reviewers as part of the public comment process. We'll specifically ask for comment on those issues, and as we talked about, we'll give hopefully more than enough time for people to look at both the groundwater and the surface water standardized methods to be able to suggest improvements, suggest alternatives to get this. There's not a time element, a deadline that we're working against, but we want to make sure that we have a good workable program here, and we're willing to listen and take your comments and make sure that happens.
Karen, you may have mentioned this, but I just wanted to also point out that for both the oil method and the groundwater method, there will be a supporting separate report that will go through the method and also provide documentation on these examples.
Yes. Yep.
Are these calculations you're envisioning the department to do or the LSP to do?
Good question. You're I think this is a really cool part of this, much to their dismay.
I'm neutral on it.
This is a spreadsheet. Yeah. If you have the values, you can easily put them in. You can put them in.
So this could be like the short form. You can just put it up on the web.
Right. Now the question is, and we will be asking this question. We want input. In January, you saw the spilled surface water work. that was a lot more straightforward. I think that lends itself to having an EDEP form, essentially with the calculations in the background, where you plug in a few values and it spits out a number at the end, or write a check, put in your MasterCard. I think that's a lot easier. Here, I'm not as kind of gung-ho and committed that, I mean, the spreadsheet is there. It could be done, but I think there are a lot of factors in here that are more variable. So one of the things we're certainly asking for comment on is, once we develop a standardized method and have a set of default assumptions, are those default assumptions close enough to kind of the universe of sites that we're seeing so that it makes sense to use them? Or is it just a starting point for the department to run this spreadsheet and tweak those numbers and make it more site-specific, but using a nice, simple, standardized approach? So I think that may be the middle ground that, my gut says that may be where we would head for the groundwater, and that the surface water may be more likely to be a simpler thing that could be self-implemented.
Have other states attempted to move with a plan like this?
Other states, New Jersey has a method. The way that they calculate the monetary damages is different because they don't have the same type of interim wellhead protection area, et cetera, that we do in Massachusetts. The state of Missouri and the state of Minnesota are both in the process of developing methods, and theirs are different simply because their geology is so markedly different than ours in terms of determining extent of injury. The state of Tennessee is looking at developing a method as well. The state of New Mexico has settled many, many groundwater cases over the years, but I think all of them have been site-specific analyses as opposed to one standard method. Well, Washington's doesn't have a groundwater method.
Okay.
They have the oil spill method.
Yeah, I would generalize it more. There are states, as Gary said, that have standardized methods for doing NRDA assessment.
Yes.
Or groundwater.
Within that, there are more states that have standardized methods for surface water, and fewer states that have standardized methods for groundwater. And they will differ because of geology and stuff like that, but it's still a standardized method to do the equations.
And just to reinforce what Paul said in terms of who would apply this method, whether it be internally or externally, it really is dependent, as Paul said, on whether we can come up with an appropriate and agreeable set of standard inputs, particularly around land acquisition and around wherever recharge rate here, and whether in the future we can ensure that we have a good handle on this because one of the reasons we cut it down to 5 is because Brian and I had to look back in reports to make sure that the value on the form really matched what we were looking to analyze. So if we can get to a point where we have confidence in a lot of standard inputs and there is the information available, it would be relatively easy to plug in the numbers. It's just getting to that point of feeling that we have confidence in that and don't need to necessarily make adjustments as we move forward.
Cool.
Oh, yeah.
I think that sums it up pretty well. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Liz, next meeting? May, June? We're not going to be here in June. So
yeah, so we should probably meet in May.
So or maybe we should have it.
Yes, we are not meeting in June.
We're definitely not meeting in June. Just